With us today is John Maxwell. We are lucky he is back on the show. John's the #1 New York Times bestselling author, coach, and speaker. He has sold more than, wait for it, 31 million books in 50 languages. So chances are you've read at least one of his books if you're listening to this. If you haven't, you absolutely should. And probably the book that you should read is his latest book, which I thought was terrific. The Leader's Greatest Return, Attracting, Developing, and Multiplying Leaders. And this is a subject that John takes a deep dive into. We have talked with him a little bit about this beforehand. It's important enough to go deeper into and critical. I was just coaching a senior leader in an organization who said, my biggest issue is I've got to develop the leadership of my team so that they are leaders and they are developing leaders also. So I said, wow, what an amazing thing to ask me about. I'm talking to John later today, and I'm going to ask him some of the questions you're asking me. So John, it's so delightful to have you on the Bregman Leadership Podcast. Thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be with you, Peter. Great to be with your listeners too. We're going to have a good time.
Yeah. So give us the, so your books, you've, I don't even know how many books you've written, but 31 million, you've sold 31 million of them. So, assuming you sell 1 million of each book, that's at least 31 books, but I think you're up at the 50 level. I can't remember exactly what. Do you know how many books you've written?
No, not really.
No.
People ask me all the time, and a bunch.
A bunch. So my question is, after all of the wealth of knowledge that you've shared, why this one? Why now?
Well, I'm very excited about The Leader's Greatest Return because when I was a young leader, I never had anybody come to me and say, invest in the people around you. I didn't know to. And so therefore, I just did my best to kind of build whatever I was building and help people. But when I turned 40, Peter,
which was just a couple of years ago, right?
Yeah, it was just 32 years ago. but when I turned 40, I began to evaluate my first half, and I realized I was a little disappointed. I realized that I had not achieved all the things I wanted to achieve, and so I began to kind of go deep dive into that, and I came to the conclusion that I had not really spent the time, invested the time in the people around me, my team, like I needed to. I'd done a good job developing myself and investing in me. And I had teams, but I pretty much kind of just gave them jobs and expect them to do the jobs. And I hadn't really taken them, mentored them, developed them, and empowered them like I needed to be great leaders. And so I made a commitment at 40 that I was going to change that I was going to make that my #1 priority, investing in my key players. Out of that time came one of the laws, the 21 irrefutable laws of leadership, the law of the inner circle, which basically say that, those who are closest to you to determine the level of your success. And so for 32 years, I've done that. Now the book, because what's happened is I have been at this leadership development game long enough to see the unbelievable, incredible return you have when you invest in your people and mentor them and empower them and give them a chance to practice leadership. And so this is what the book is all about, because there are many people that are watching and listening, and I want to encourage them I'm giving a picture 10, 15 years down the road. I want to just say, hey, do this now and watch the return that you receive down the road.
Now you're a little unusual because, or maybe not, maybe I'm unusual, but I look at a lot of thought leaders, of which you're one, right? You've really delved into this. You teach, you develop new methodologies. And I find that a lot of thought leaders, and I would put myself in this category also, tend to love ideas and love to share them and develop them and think about them and speak about them and write about them and coach about them. But in terms of actual management of people, oftentimes, like, we don't really love it. And I'll sort of speak for myself, like, I don't really love it. Like, I don't think I'm the best manager of people. I think I can help people manage people really well, but I'm not the best manager of people. That I would sort of rather, delve deep into something, write something, etc. And does this come naturally to you, John? Is this something that you sort of look at and you go, well, I really want to develop people, and it turns out that I love it? Do you like hate it but force yourself to do it? Like, I'm sort of curious about your experience of it.
Well, my experience is that I know that my success with the people that I develop and work with is going to determine my success. And so that is my I love people, so I enjoy working with them. But I especially enjoy working with leaders because the return is so much higher. And so what I early on learned was that I had to prioritize. I had to prioritize the people I spent time with. I have a chapter in The Leader's Greatest Return on invite them to sit at the leadership table. And it's a whole chapter about bringing people into leadership discussions and interactions and questions so that you can find the ones who kind of lean in and have maybe a leadership propensity versus those who don't. And I love to have those kind of discussions. And then when I find somebody that has really a kind of a leaning toward leadership, to be able to take that person and equip them and help them to experience some wins under their belt. Because somebody can tell you that you're really good, but what you're going to discover very quickly is that affirmation without action and some wins under your belt is very shallow and very hollow. And so what I tell people all the time is just very simply, look, I'm going to help you get some wins under your belt, and that'll give you confidence and self-confidence for you to move on and do really well in your life. And to see them succeed is really my reward. I'm 72, and people say, well, would you like to go back 10, 20 years? No, I like where I am now because I'm getting to see people. I'm getting to see the fruit of my labor. And most of my readers don't have that perspective yet. So this is a book to say, okay, hang in there, stay on this road of developing leaders, and let me give you a picture of what it's going to look like down the road.
So I'd love to get dirty, kind of in the down and dirty of it. And one of the challenges that I find in developing leaders and that I hear from leaders that I'm coaching and working with is I could coach people, but in the end, I'm not in the room with them. There are, 7 out of 10 people, 8 out of 10 people, I know they're doing really well. I could see the results, etc. 2 out of 10, I get mixed feedback. I'm not in the room with them. I hear one thing from them. I hear something else from other people. And how do I get enough information to really develop them in a way that's gonna help them when they're leaders on their own? I'm not holding
Sure.
their hand through it.
Well, sometimes you don't. First of all, it's not a world where you can get all the feedback and the information and the visualness.
Right.
I mean, there's power in proximity, but sometimes you don't get proximity.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what it is it's an odds game. It's an odds game. If you put the right stuff in the right people, the odds are not all of them, but many of them will really improve and get better. And so, therefore, a long time ago, I realized I didn't have the privilege of doing one-on-one with a lot of people. In fact, I have a wonderful friend, Andy Stanley, whose expression is do for one what you wish you could do for many. And so I think once you begin to understand these leadership development principles, pour into one or two or a few that you do have that proximity with. For me, for example, it's Mark Cole. And Mark owns and oversees the John Maxwell enterprise, basically. And to be able to be close to him and watch him develop is just nothing but pure joy for me. But most of the people, I don't get to see their action, or I don't get to be close enough to see the fruit of it. But when I travel or when I meet them, they'll come up to me and they'll say, look, let me tell you something. It was this book that really equipped me. It was this book that really kind of got me started off in the right direction. So I don't see them all, but I do know this. It's an odds game. You do the right thing for the right people, and not all the time, but most of the time it'll turn out right.
Let's take a step back and just define leader, because I'm realizing we're having this conversation about leaders and I want to ask a few more questions, but we should make sure that we're on the same page about how do you define leader?
Leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less. That's been my classic definition of leadership for 45 years. And it just really works. It's very simple. And so therefore, a lot of people, they want to tweak it. But let me just put it this way. In any given time, any given group, for any given room, at any given reason, the person who has the most influence in that group is the leader of the pack. They may have the title. They may not have the title. Doesn't matter. Leadership is influence.
So there's, thinking of an example of a CEO of an organization who has influence, and he drives what happens in this organization, and he is feared, and people don't really share the truth with him because he is unpredictable. The turnover is pretty high. People find it a little untenable to work with him for long periods of time. And yet, by the definition of leader, he really fits that definition.
Oh, it does. And another statement I make is everything rises and falls on leadership. So in the scenario that you just gave me, Peter, the good news is he has the influence. The bad news is it's probably to the detriment of the people, not to an asset. So, the best thing that can happen to a group of people is a good leader, and the worst thing that can happen to a group of people is a bad leader.
Right. So they're leaders because they have influence, and whether they're productive or unproductive depends on how they wield that influence and the way in which the character with which they bring to that influence.
Yes, so I'm just defining leadership. If you said, would you define good leadership, then I would say that's to influence people in a positive way. Would you define bad leadership? Well, that's to influence people in a negative way, but leadership still is influence.
And how do you identify whether someone has, even if they're not showing it yet, the potential or the capability to be a great leader?
Well, I think three things that I look for. Number one is, do they have the ability to produce themselves? In other words, whenever you give them an assignment or a job, do they bring it home? Do they produce results? Do they have the ability to get it done and to get it done well? That's one. Number two is, do they have the ability to get others to do it? The reason one is essential is if I can't do it for myself, the odds are very high I can't do it for you either. And so it starts with I can do it for myself. Now, can John help Peter accomplish that and do that? And if okay, I got a yes on the first one, I got a yes on the second one, and the third question is, how teachable are you? Because even though you have the ability to do it yourself or get others to do it, if you don't have teachability in it, you don't have growth potential, because all growth comes from the willingness to listen and learn and apply and improve yourself.
And how do you assess teachability?
Well, I assess teachability by the fact that when I'm with a person, they not only listen and take their notes, etc., but then they go and they apply it. And it's kind of like one of the fellows I was mentoring after my first mentoring session. About a month later, he wanted to have a second one, and so when he called me up, he said, "John, okay, last time we were together, this is what you taught me. This is what I learned. This is how I applied what I learned. Did I do a good job with it? Can I now talk to you again?" And the answer is yes, 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 because you showed that you were learning, you were listening, that you were applying, and how did I do, and can we do it again? That's all part of teachability, is the willingness and the desire to want to learn.
What are some signs you have? How quickly can you tell, what, this person just doesn't have it? Meaning I find that's a decision that leaders often are slow on, which is to say, to pull the plug on somebody and say, you know what, I'm going to move on. I'm going to let someone go. It's a very, very hard decision. It's an emotionally laden decision. But oftentimes by the time they make the decision that someone's not going to be able to show up as a leader, and that there's already been so much damage. Like, it's such an obvious decision because they've waited so long. How could people get a jump start on that?
Yeah, I'm reminded, I didn't say this, it's not original to me, but somebody said, hire slow, fire fast, in the whole process. Well, but I do have a kind of a way for a person to really figure this out. So let's say, for example, Peter, you're on the team and you've been with me for 6 months, maybe a year, and I'm still looking at you and I'm thinking, I'm not sure. I'm just not sure. So I encourage leaders to ask themselves this question. The question is very simple. If I knew what I know about you right now, today, and I had a chance to hire you, in other words, you weren't working with me, but but you asked for a job. Knowing what I know now about you after we've worked together for maybe a year, would I hire you? And if the answer is yes, that shows me that probably I feel that you're inclined to make it. If the answer is no, obviously you're inclined not to make it. And if the answer is I don't know, I wait 3 months. And if it's still I don't know, I let you go because I'm just not dealing with reality.
Right. It reminds me of an investment that I didn't know if I should stay in or not, and a friend of mine, an investor, asked me the same question. If
Yeah,
you had that amount of money right now, would you invest it in the stock? If the answer is
that
no, then then you pull out because it's not the
yep,
right investment.
that's a great way to
Right.
assess it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You said something that piqued my interest a minute ago, which is that of the three ways, three things that a leader should be doing. First of all, or how you know that you've got a great leader is the first thing is, are they able to execute and do it? The second thing is, are they able to help others to execute? Because if they're not able to do it themselves, they probably won't be very effective at helping others execute. And what I wonder about that, because I think of coaches, I think of on basic like coaches in basketball, who the coach could never execute the way a great basketball player could execute, but they could absolutely help the person, perform at excellence. And I wonder if the same thing isn't true of leaders, which is, someone may not be themselves a great leader, but they might be really great at creating and building leaders, which ultimately is the greatest return, right? Which is multiplying leaders. So I might be great at multiplying leaders, though I may not be a great leader myself. Do you see that, or is that just a hypothetical?
No, well, it's legitimate, but your example, most of the coaches probably don't have the ability to perform to the level of the players this time. But there is an assumption at one time they did have the ability to perform as a player. Now, there are exceptions where a coach never maybe, quote, played the game, but that's very rare.
Mm-hmm.
That's very rare. Um, we teach what we know, but we reproduce who we are. And so many times I think we miss that part. And so what I've said before is that what gives a person credibility to lead in the first place is they've succeeded themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, think about it, Peter. If you're going to get on a team, if you're not going to want to be on a team with somebody that hasn't produced themselves. You want to know that they've been successful, because if they've been successful, the odds are they can probably help you be successful. But if they haven't been, I mean, who's to say they can help you? So I think as a principle, there are always exceptions, but as a principle, I really want to see somebody who has been successful themselves. And if that's the case, now can they help other people successful? Now, I know a lot of people who have been personally successful, but they don't have the ability or the desire to transfer it to anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
And they truly do become a self-made type person. So I know that, but that's why I asked the second question: can that person help other people produce? Then the third question, obviously, is are they teachable? Because all of mentoring has the foundation of the person that you're mentoring really being receptive to personal change and growth.
Right. Let's do a deep dive in the later part of the book, where you're really talking about team up leaders so that they can multiply their impact, and also, help leaders create other leaders, right? That feels so critical. And I want to do a little bit of a deep dive. Like, what are some techniques? What are some tips? What are some things you can share with our listeners to help them support and create leaders who create leaders?
It's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it, because honestly, I think this is the big miss with most leaders. Um, Most leaders, first of all, Peter, they really don't develop other leaders. They just have followers. Okay,
Right.
so let's just start there. And the reason is having followers is easy, developing leaders is hard. And so,
well, also I think there's potential. There's like an ego component to it, which is if I'm developing leaders, it's like a threat to my own leadership, or I'm giving up. I'm really giving up control, or I'm like making myself much less necessary. And I think for people who don't have sufficient ego strength or aren't confident enough in themselves, that feels really risky.
Well, it is risky for them, and in fact, insecure leaders never empower other people. So, honestly, if you're an insecure leader, if it's a power issue, if it's an ego issue, if it's a security issue, honestly, you're not going to develop other leaders. You develop leaders, that becomes a threat to you. So I'm going to make an assumption, and the assumption I'm going to make is that you really would like to have other leaders. Because see, where an insecure leader, their whole desire is to be indispensable.
Mm-hmm.
What they want to hear more than anything else, Peter, is people say, "Oh my gosh, I can't do it without you. We couldn't do it without you. What would we do if you weren't here?" They love that stuff.
Right.
Whereas great leaders, they want to be dispensable.
Right.
They realize that their job is to build up, equip, and train and develop people until really they can leave.
Yeah, it's actually interesting. The top leaders, the best leaders I know, the people I've coached who have really, who I know intimately, who have been most successful are the ones who have actually very balanced lives. And the reason they have balanced lives is because they're not running around trying to do everything, because they've got really good teams. And so
have no desire to do everything.
And they're very good at distinguishing signal from noise. And one of the signals is, do I have really great people around me who are executing and building leaders themselves?
Yeah, there's a statement that says it's wonderful when the people believe in the leader, but it's even more wonderful when the leader believes in the people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so what we're talking about here is a secure leader. So now let's go to back to your game plan question. If I want to develop leaders that develop leaders, how do I do that? Now, there are several things I talk about in the book, but let me give you a couple of them quickly. First of all, when I bring people into executive positions, one of the first things I would say to them is, I want you to do this job really well. But what I really want you to do while you're doing it very well is I want you to raise up a leader to do it. In fact, what I want you to do is work yourself out of a job.
So you set that as an expectation early on.
Right on the front.
Right? This is what the game is.
Yeah. Now, you got to do the job well yourself first. So let's have excellence in the job and what it requires. Because if you're going to go find somebody to take over and train them and develop them, they've got to have a good model of excellence. So do your job well, but while you're doing your job well, constantly be saying, and who am I going to train to take the job? In fact, my statement was, I'm hiring you to work yourself out of this job.
Mm-hmm.
And the good news is if you work yourself out of this job, I'll give you another job.
Exactly.
But if you don't work yourself out of this job, I'm not sure I'm going to give you another job. In fact, I may take the job you have away from you. Now, that is setting an expectation, a leadership culture where you can honestly say leaders are made here. Well, it's because you're encouraging them to go and find somebody and train them and develop them and create what I call a practicing leadership environment.
Well, here's what I like about it also, John, is that it becomes its own lens or its own filter for making sure you've got people with sufficient ego strength, right? Because if they're willing to work themselves out of their job because they know they're confident enough they could take the other one on, then you're off to the races. But if they're not, and they're worried about working themselves out of a job, and that they're worried that they won't have a job after that, then they're probably not confident enough to build the kind of leaders around them that you're really expecting.
You got it exactly. You're sensing. And so up front, when I mentor or develop somebody, I want to know who they're going to mentor and develop.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like I'm equipping you just to equip you. I'm equipping you to go equip somebody else.
Right.
So what the test of a successful equipping leader is that when he or she is done equipping someone, they're already equipping someone else.
So let me ask you a question. Sorry, yes. Go ahead, John. I interrupted you.
Well, no, it's okay. It's just that's where the multiplication compounding begins.
So here's a question, which is, what about someone like you? So, for example, and I'm thinking about I'm thinking about founders in firms, and I'm thinking about people who really are, to a certain extent, irreplaceable. So there are things for which you are replaceable, but there are things because you're the talent. There are ways in which you are irreplaceable, right? Like there's a reason your name is on this book, and so what I'm curious about is, does that work in organizations where there's talent? And it could be, like an actor, it could be, the person who is in the limelight in a sense.
Sure.
Does the same thing work, or are there slightly different rules that apply?
No, it's a good question. I would say that my role with my organizations is more than anything else is I'm a rainmaker,
Mm-hmm.
and you just can't always develop rainmakers, or you
Right.
can't always reproduce rainmakers, and that's what you're really talking about. But 90% of everything that I am that helps the companies and makes me unique is reproducible,
Mm-hmm.
not 100%. And so the mistake people make a lot of times is they see that 10% that's not reproducible, and they say, well, it's no sense me trying to develop anybody anyway, because literally they can't replace my speaking ability, or they can't, they don't have my incredible creativity or whatever. And what I tell people is, first of all, you're going to die. So let's just say you're not going to be hanging around forever. The challenge with people like myself is we hang on too long. If the team is going to win the relay race, you don't have the baton off to the next member when you're all fatigued and you're kind of just about to drop out of the race. No, you have to hand it off at top speed. Most people in my positions as leaders, they hold on to their position too long.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I tell them all the time is, hand the baton off when you're still going strong. It gives the team the best chance to win. And hey, who says that in that 10% rainmaker, whatever it is, hang around and keep making rain for them? But 90% can be passed off to other people. They can be trained, they can be developed, and the more that they are growing around me, the more influence they get, which allows them to have a much better shot of being successful.
Right. What have you noticed when you have a leader who is like really sincerely wants to develop leaders, like really sincerely wants to develop leaders around them, and has very high standards of how things should be done, and maybe even very particular standards. So there's like almost like an unconscious control over how things go. So, and this goes to some of what you write about in terms of empowering leaders.
Yes.
That it's not from a bad place. It's not from I need to be, I need to, I'm afraid you're going to replace me place, but it's I care so much about the standard of what we do that unless you can really, really meet the standard, I don't really want to give you anything, which obviously makes it hard for that person to develop.
Yeah, what happens is that kind of spirit and attitude is a major loss. I know people who say, well, I'm not going to hand it off to someone else until they can do it better than I can do it. And I just basically say that's not the purpose of handing it off. How do you develop leaders? Let them practice leadership. You weren't that good in the beginning, and I wasn't that good in the beginning. We had to practice. It's much better off in a leadership culture to hand that baton off and have a culture that is conducive for that person to learn from their mistakes and grow, than it is to have a high standard. You see, when people have a high standard like that, say, well, I'm not sure they can do it as well as I can do it, I say that isn't the purpose of handing it off. You see, it's still a control issue. You can't have heavy control and have great growth at the same time. And you have
Say that again, because I think it's really important.
Yeah, you can't have heavy control. In other words, I can't basically try to fit everybody into my mold and determine that they have to be able to do it like I do it and do it the same way I do it, or else they're not going to get that assignment. Because what happens is growth is dependent upon action, and action is dependent upon the freedom to act. And a leadership culture basically says, part of growing as a leader is making mistakes and having misses, and it's okay. So you're going to have some misses, and what we're here is we're here to correct them quickly and get you back on the track. But we're not expecting you to be perfect, but we are expecting you to give it a good shot, and we're going to mentor you and help you. But you have to give people permission to lead, and giving them permission to lead. There's the wins and there are the losses, and it's okay. Shake the dust off the losses and get right back into the game. What happens is, if you help a person go through the misses and the losses, and you say, okay, here, let's look at this. What went wrong? How could we have done this better? What would you change now? And okay, and the moment that they begin to learn from that loss, then get them back out there again, because in probability they're not going to repeat it again because they learned from it.
Right. John, this has been incredibly interesting and helpful. Any last thoughts that you have, or anything else that you want to share with us before we close?
Well, yeah, Peter, I have one last thought, and that is the fact that when I wrote this book, The Leader's Greatest Return, this book was written for men and women who want to have a long life of successfully leading people. In my early career, I was very disappointed by a young leader that I poured my life into, mentored them, and they just went south, and I had such high expectations and ended up having to fire them. And I can remember for 6 months, I got really gun shy, and I just said, I'm not going to develop any more leaders. I'm going to do it myself. After all, I'm not going to mess myself up. And in that 6 month period of time, it was a great struggle for me. And what I learned on the other side of that was, the good news is if you don't empower and develop other leaders and give them the privilege of going out and trying, the good news is they won't hurt you. But the bad news is they can't help you.
Mm-hmm.
And I determined then, as a young leader, that there would be a few times in my life I would be hurt by empowering people, but I would be helped so much more than hurt, that it's worth a couple shots that I've had to have. And it's been very true. I've been hurt a few times, but I've been helped a lot of times. And this is kind of an empowering book for leaders to read that basically says, come on, John Maxwell's giving you the green light. Go out, do your best to train, equip, mentor young leaders, let them practice the leadership, bless them, and watch the huge return that you'll get in the long run for it.
I've made a couple of analogies to investing. I guess I've been thinking about investing recently, but it's the same thing, which is that if you're really afraid of losing money on any stock, you're never going to invest in any stock, and your money will stay in cash, and you're not going to grow. And it's kind of the same thing. It's like with people, we're more hesitant to take some of those risks sometimes. But I think that's also where, when I'm listening to you, you've got to make the decisions when it's not working to act fast enough that you don't become gun shy about bringing anybody else in.
Hey, I hope every one of those who watch the program and listen to it catch what you just caught.
John, thank you so much. We're with John Maxwell, the legend. His book is The Leader's Greatest Return, Attracting, Developing, and Multiplying Leaders. John, as always, it is such a pleasure talking with you, and I'm so glad that you could make it onto the Bregman Leadership Podcast. Thank you so much for being with us.
It's always great to be with you, Peter. Thank you very much.